Sarah Martinez had always been the careful type. At 28, she worked as a marine biologist for the National Oceanic Institute, spending most of her days in laboratories analyzing water samples and studying marine ecosystems. Her colleagues often joked that she was more comfortable with microscopes than mountains, but Sarah had a secret passion that few people knew about. Every weekend, she would drive 3 hours north to the coastal mountains, where she practiced rock climbing on the safer, well-marked trails. It wasn't about conquering dangerous peaks or pushing extreme limits. For Sarah, climbing was meditation in motion, a way to disconnect from the endless stream of data and research reports that filled her weekdays. On this particular Saturday morning in October, Sarah had planned what should have been a routine climb along the Serpentine Ridge, a popular intermediate trail that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. The weather forecast had been perfect, with clear skies and minimal wind. She had checked her equipment twice, as she always did, and arrived at the trailhead just as the sun was painting the ocean in shades of gold and orange. The parking area was busier than usual. A group of young men in expensive outdoor gear were loudly discussing their plans to tackle the advanced routes on the northern face of the ridge. Sarah recognized the type immediately: weekend warriors with more money than experience, the kind who bought the latest equipment but skipped the years of careful practice that made climbing truly safe. She ignored their boisterous conversation and focused on her own preparation. Sarah methodically checked her harness, tested her ropes, and verified that her helmet was properly adjusted. She had learned long ago that rushing through safety checks was the fastest way to turn an enjoyable climb into a dangerous situation. The leader of the loud group, a man in his early 30s with perfectly styled hair and gear that looked like it had never seen actual rock, noticed her meticulous preparation. "Hey there," he called out, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to getting attention. "You look like you know what you're doing. Want to join us for a real challenge?" Sarah glanced up from her gear check. The man was handsome in an obvious way, with the kind of smile that probably worked well in nightclubs but seemed out of place on a mountain. His 3 companions looked similar, well-groomed, expensively equipped, and radiating the particular brand of arrogance that came from success in fields that had nothing to do with outdoor skills. "Thanks, but I have my own route planned," Sarah replied politely, returning her attention to her equipment. "Come on," the man persisted, stepping closer. His name tag read Brad in expensive embossed letters. "We're heading up the Devil's Backbone. It's where the real climbers go. You look like you could handle it." Sarah knew the Devil's Backbone well, though she had never attempted it. It was an expert-level route that required advanced technical skills and years of experience. The fact that these men were planning to tackle it with their obvious lack of preparation sent alarm bells ringing in her head. "That route requires permits and advanced certification," she said carefully. "The Park Service doesn't allow casual access because of the danger level." Brad laughed, a sound that held no warmth. "Permits are for tourists and people who follow every little rule. We know a way up that bypasses all that bureaucratic nonsense." His companion, a shorter man with an expensive watch that looked ridiculous on a climbing harness, chimed in. "Brad's dad owns half the development projects along this coast. We're not exactly worried about park rangers." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had encountered this attitude before, people who believed that wealth and connections could substitute for skill and safety. In her work as a marine biologist, she had seen too many examples of what happened when people ignored natural laws and safety protocols. "I really think you should stick to the marked trails," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "The weather can change quickly up there, and without proper certification, it's just not worth the risk." The reaction was immediate and ugly. Brad's friendly mask slipped, revealing something cold and entitled underneath. "Who asked for your opinion? Just because you're afraid to take risks doesn't mean everyone else should limit themselves to kiddie trails." His friends laughed, the sound echoing off the rocky walls around the parking area. Other climbers were beginning to notice the confrontation, though most seemed content to mind their own business. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "I'm not afraid. I'm experienced enough to know the difference between acceptable risk and reckless endangerment." "Experienced?" Brad's voice dripped with mockery. "Lady, you're checking your gear like you're planning to climb Everest and you're heading for the bunny slope. That's not experience, that's paranoia." The confrontation might have ended there, with Sarah simply walking away to begin her planned route. She had dealt with difficult personalities before and knew that engaging with people like Brad rarely led anywhere productive. But as she turned to leave, she heard him say something that stopped her cold. "Besides," Brad continued, his voice carrying clearly across the parking area, "what would some lab geek know about real climbing anyway? She probably spends her time looking at pond scum through a microscope." Sarah turned back, her professional pride stung. "For your information, I've been climbing for 8 years. I've completed routes in 3 states and volunteer with mountain rescue services. And my work involves studying oceanic ecosystems that are probably more complex than anything you've encountered in your business world." The group fell silent for a moment, then Brad's face twisted into an unpleasant sneer. "Mountain rescue? Well, aren't you special? I bet you're one of those people who thinks everyone needs to follow every little safety rule and regulation." "Safety rules exist for a reason," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. "They're written in blood by people who learned hard lessons. Ignoring them doesn't make you brave, it makes you stupid." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Brad's face flushed red, and his companions shifted uncomfortably. Other climbers in the parking area had stopped their preparations to watch the confrontation unfold. "Stupid," Brad's voice rose dangerously. "You want to see stupid. Stupid is spending your whole life so scared of taking risks that you never accomplish anything worth remembering." Sarah realized she had crossed a line, but she was too committed to back down now. "And stupid is risking your life to prove something to people whose opinions shouldn't matter to you in the first place." What happened next unfolded so quickly that later, Sarah would struggle to piece together the exact sequence of events. Brad stepped forward aggressively, his face dark with anger. His companions moved with him, forming a loose semicircle around Sarah. "You think you're better than us," Brad snarled. "You think your little certificates and your careful preparation make you superior to people who actually take chances and achieve success." Sarah backed toward her car, suddenly aware that the confrontation had moved beyond verbal sparring into something potentially dangerous. Other climbers were watching now, but none seemed inclined to intervene in what appeared to be a personal dispute. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I just think safety should come before ego." "Safety," Brad spat, "the last refuge of people who are too scared to really live." He continued advancing, forcing Sarah to back further away from the other climbers. His companions followed, their expensive gear clanking softly as they moved. Sarah realized with growing alarm that they were herding her toward the edge of the parking area, where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. "You want to talk about safety?" Brad continued, his voice taking on a menacing tone. "Let's talk about the safety of minding your own business when people are having a conversation that doesn't involve you." Sarah's back foot hit loose gravel, and she realized she was running out of room to retreat. The edge of the parking area was less than 10 feet behind her, marked only by a low barrier of stones that wouldn't stop anyone from going over. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her voice showing the first signs of real fear. "I'm going to start my climb now. I hope you all have a safe day on the mountain." She tried to move around the group, but Brad shifted to block her path. His companions moved with him, maintaining their loose formation. Sarah realized with growing panic that they weren't going to let her simply walk away. "See, that's your problem," Brad said, his voice now carrying a cold edge that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "You think you can just give your opinion, insult people, and then walk away like nothing happened." "I apologized for calling you stupid," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she actually had. "That was out of line, but this needs to stop now." "Oh, it's going to stop," Brad agreed. "The question is how." The next few seconds played out like frames in a slow-motion film. Brad lunged forward, not quite attacking, but moving aggressively enough to force Sarah backward. She stumbled on the loose gravel, her arms windmilling as she tried to regain her balance. His companions, perhaps caught up in the moment or responding to some signal Sarah missed, surged forward as well. One of them, the man with the expensive watch, shoved her shoulder hard enough to spin her around. Sarah's foot hit the low stone barrier, and suddenly there was nothing but air behind her. She had a brief, terrifying moment to see the rocky slope falling away below, to understand exactly what was about to happen before gravity took over. The fall itself lasted only seconds, but Sarah experienced it as an eternity of terror and desperate calculation. The slope wasn't quite vertical, but it was steep enough that she couldn't control her descent. Rocks and loose soil cascaded around her as she tumbled, her climbing helmet ringing like a bell each time it struck stone. Her training kicked in automatically. Even as terror flooded her mind, her body responded with techniques learned in countless safety courses. She tried to protect her head and spine, curling into a defensive position while using her arms and legs to absorb impact and control her fall as much as possible. The sound of her descent echoed off the canyon walls, crashing rocks, tearing fabric, and her own involuntary cries of pain and fear. Above her, she could hear shouting, though whether it was expressions of concern or something else, she couldn't tell. Sarah struck an outcropping of rock about 40 feet down, the impact driving the air from her lungs and sending lightning bolts of pain through her left shoulder. The collision spun her around and sent her tumbling down another section of steep slope, this one covered in loose scree that offered no handholds or opportunity to arrest her fall. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 seconds, she came to rest on a narrow ledge about 80 feet below the parking area. The ledge was barely wide enough for her body, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet continuing below. For long moments, Sarah simply lay still, afraid that any movement might send her over the edge of the ledge and into the void below. Her entire body felt like it had been put through a blender, and she was afraid to take inventory of her injuries. When she finally tried to move, the results were both better and worse than she had feared. Her left arm was definitely broken, sending waves of nausea through her body whenever she tried to move it. Her left leg felt wrong, not necessarily broken but severely injured. Blood was trickling down her face from somewhere under her helmet, and every breath brought sharp pains that suggested broken ribs. But she was alive, and she was conscious, and the ledge beneath her seemed solid enough to support her weight. As terrifying as her situation was, it could have been much worse. Above her, the shouting had stopped. Sarah craned her neck to look up, sending fresh waves of pain through her injured body. She could see the edge of the parking area as a thin line against the sky, impossibly far above her current position. "Help," she called out, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I'm hurt, I need help." There was no response. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the rocky canyon and the distant crash of waves against the shore below. Sarah called out again, putting as much strength into her voice as she could manage. Still no response. A terrible possibility began to form in her mind, that Brad and his companions had simply left her there, that they had caused her fall and then abandoned her to deal with the consequences alone. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. If no one knew where she was, if no one was coming to help her, she could die on this ledge. The October sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, and desert nights could be brutally cold. Sarah forced herself to think systematically about her situation, the way she had been trained to do in emergency scenarios. She was injured but alive. She was on a stable surface, at least for now. She had some water and emergency supplies in her pack, if she could reach them without falling off the ledge. Most importantly, she had not told anyone about her specific climbing plans for the day. It was a safety violation that she had never made before, but this weekend she had been so focused on escaping the stress of her work that she had skipped her usual check-in protocols. No one would miss her until Monday morning when she failed to show up for work. By then, if she was still alive, she would have spent 2 nights on this ledge without proper shelter or medical attention for her injuries. As if responding to her thoughts, clouds began to gather on the horizon, suggesting that the perfect weather forecast might not be as reliable as she had hoped. The possibility of rain, or even snow at this elevation in October, added another layer of danger to her already precarious situation. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to center herself, the way she did when faced with particularly complex research problems. Panic would kill her faster than her injuries. She needed to be smart, systematic, and patient if she was going to survive long enough for rescue to arrive. When she opened her eyes, she began to carefully explore the limits of her prison. The ledge was about 3 feet wide and perhaps 8 feet long, with solid rock walls rising above and falling away below. There was no obvious way to climb up or down, at least not in her current condition. Her climbing gear was scattered around the ledge where it had fallen from her pack during the tumble. Some pieces had bounced off into the void, but she could see her rope coiled against the rock wall, along with several carabiners and one of her water bottles. Moving with infinite care, Sarah began to inch her way toward her supplies. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her injured body, but she forced herself to continue. If she was going to survive, she would need every resource she could gather. As she moved, she found herself thinking about the events that had led to her fall. Had Brad and his friends intended to hurt her, or had it been an accident born of aggression and poor judgment? Either way, they had left her to die, and that knowledge filled her with a cold anger that helped push back the fear. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, and Sarah continued her careful inventory of resources and injuries. She was hurt, she was trapped, and she was alone. But she was alive, and she was thinking clearly, and she was not going to give up without a fight. Somewhere above her, the world continued its normal rhythm. Cars drove past on distant highways, people went about their weekend activities, and life moved forward in all its ordinary complexity. But on this narrow ledge, with the vast canyon dropping away below, Sarah Martinez began the most important battle of her life. The battle to survive until someone noticed she was missing. The battle to stay warm through the approaching night. The battle to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming odds. And somewhere in the distance, though she didn't know it yet, forces were already moving that would determine whether her battle would end in rescue or tragedy. Commander Jake Stone Morrison had been awake for 36 hours straight, but fatigue was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. His SEAL Team 6 unit was halfway through what was supposed to be a routine training exercise in maritime cliff assault techniques when the emergency call came through their communication system. The training had been going well. His 8-man team had successfully completed 3 different scenarios involving scaling coastal cliffs under simulated combat conditions. They were some of the most experienced operators in the Navy, veterans of deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, and half a dozen other places that didn't officially exist in any government records. Morrison himself was 34 years old, a career Navy man who had earned his stripes through 12 years of special operations work. His team called him Stone because of his legendary calm under pressure, though the nickname also reflected his stubborn refusal to abandon a mission or leave a teammate behind. The emergency call that interrupted their training came from the Coast Guard's Search and Rescue Coordination Center. A hiker had been reported missing in the coastal mountains, and the initial aerial reconnaissance suggested she was trapped on an inaccessible ledge in terrain too dangerous for standard rescue operations. "Stone, we've got a civilian in trouble," his commanding officer's voice crackled through the radio. "Female, late 20s, stuck on a cliff face about 60 miles north of your current position. Local emergency services are requesting immediate assistance." Morrison acknowledged the transmission and gathered his team. They were already equipped for vertical operations, having spent the morning practicing with ropes, climbing gear, and fast rope techniques from helicopters. What they hadn't expected was to transition from training to an actual life-or-death rescue mission. His team consisted of 7 other operators, each with specialized skills that made them among the most capable soldiers in the world. There was Rodriguez, a former rock climbing instructor who could scale virtually anything. Thompson, a medic whose emergency medical training had saved dozens of lives in combat zones. Williams, their communications specialist who could establish contact in the most challenging environments. The others, Chen, Jackson, Parker, and Davis, were all seasoned veterans with thousands of hours of training in maritime operations, fast rope insertions, and high-risk rescues. They were the kind of men who ran toward danger when everyone else was running away from it. "Listen up," Morrison told his team as they quickly gathered their gear. "We've got a civilian trapped on a cliff face. Details are sketchy, but it sounds like she's been there since yesterday morning. Time is critical, and the terrain is going to be challenging." The helicopter ride to the rescue site took 45 minutes, during which Morrison studied the preliminary reconnaissance photos and topographical maps. The area was known locally as Devil's Canyon, a series of steep-walled ravines that cut through the coastal mountains like scars. The missing hiker had been identified as Dr. Sarah Martinez, a marine biologist from the National Oceanic Institute. According to the initial reports, she had been seen at the trailhead parking area on Saturday morning, but had never returned to her vehicle. A park ranger had found her car still parked there Sunday evening and initiated the missing person protocols. The first aerial search had been conducted that morning by a Coast Guard helicopter, but the pilot had been unable to get close enough to the canyon walls to conduct a thorough visual search. The terrain was too dangerous for a standard rescue helicopter to operate effectively, with unpredictable wind currents and virtually no space for landing. "Rodriguez," Morrison called over the noise of the helicopter rotors, "what's your assessment of these cliff faces?" Rodriguez studied the photographs with the eye of someone who had spent years reading rock formations. "Looks like mostly granite with some sedimentary layers. Probably stable enough for technical climbing, but those overhangs are going to be challenging. Weather's been dry, so rockfall should be minimal." Thompson, the team medic, was reviewing the limited information they had about the missing hiker. "If she's been out there since Saturday morning, we're looking at potential hypothermia, dehydration, and possible traumatic injuries from a fall. The longer we wait, the worse her chances become." Morrison nodded grimly. In his experience, rescue operations were always a race against time, but civilian rescues carried additional weight. Military personnel were trained to handle extreme situations, but civilians often lacked the psychological and physical preparation for surviving in harsh conditions. The helicopter pilot's voice came through their headsets. "Stone, we're approaching the target area. Visibility is good, but I'm seeing some weather moving in from the west. We might have a narrow window before conditions deteriorate." Through the helicopter's windows, Morrison could see the rugged landscape unfolding below them. The coastal mountains rose directly from the Pacific Ocean, creating a dramatic landscape of cliffs, canyons, and steep-sided valleys. It was beautiful in its harshness, but he could see why it would be deadly for someone caught unprepared. "There," Williams pointed through the window. 2 o'clock, about 500 feet below the rim." Morrison followed his gaze and felt his heart sink. On a narrow ledge barely visible against the cliff face, he could make out what appeared to be a human figure. Even from this distance, it was clear that the person was in serious trouble. The ledge looked impossibly small, and there was no obvious way for a ground-based rescue team to reach it. "Can we get closer?" Morrison asked the pilot. "Negative," came the reply. "Wind shear is too unpredictable near the cliff face. I can hold position here, but I can't safely approach the ledge." Morrison studied the terrain with the tactical mind that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions. The ledge was approximately 400 feet below the canyon rim, with no visible path for a conventional rescue approach. Above the ledge, the cliff face was nearly vertical granite, while below it, the drop continued for several hundred more feet to the canyon floor. "Options?" he asked his team, though he was already forming his own plan. Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Fast rope insertion to the canyon rim, then technical descent to the ledge. We've got the gear and the training. Question is whether the rock will support anchor points for the ropes." Thompson nodded in agreement. "Medical evacuation will be the challenge. If she's seriously injured, we might need to stabilize her on the ledge before attempting to move her." Morrison was quiet for a moment, weighing the risks and options. Standard protocol would be to call in specialized civilian rescue teams with specific training in technical cliff rescues. But those teams would take hours to mobilize and reach the scene, and the weather was deteriorating. More importantly, Morrison had served in enough combat zones to recognize the signs of a situation where immediate action was the difference between life and death. The figure on the ledge had barely moved since they had spotted her, which could indicate serious injuries or advancing hypothermia. "We're going in," Morrison decided. "Rodriguez, you'll lead the technical descent. Thompson, prepare for field medical treatment. Williams, maintain communication with all parties. Everyone else, standard rescue protocols." The pilot found a relatively stable area on the canyon rim where he could hover low enough for the team to fast rope down. Morrison went first, his boots hitting the rocky ground with practiced precision. Within minutes, his entire team was on the ground and beginning their equipment check. The view from the canyon rim was even more sobering than it had been from the air. The cliff face dropped away into shadowy depths, with the rescue target barely visible on her tiny ledge far below. Wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the sound of distant ocean waves and the promise of approaching weather. Rodriguez had already begun scouting for anchor points, testing the stability of various rock formations with the methodical care of someone whose life depended on making the right choice. "Rock's solid," he reported. I can set up a reliable anchor system here. Morrison peered over the edge, trying to get a better view of the person they were attempting to rescue. From this angle, he could see that it was definitely a woman, and she appeared to be conscious but not moving much. Her position on the ledge suggested either injury or extreme caution about the drop below her. "Dr. Martinez," Morrison called down, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This is Navy Search and Rescue. Can you hear me?" For a long moment there was no response. Then, faint but clear, came a reply that filled Morrison with relief. "I'm here, I'm hurt, but I'm here." The sound of a human voice, alert and responsive, transformed the entire operation. Morrison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and focus that came with transitioning from planning to execution. "Dr. Martinez, my name is Commander Morrison. I'm with a Navy rescue team and we're going to get you out of there. How badly are you injured?" "Left arm is broken," came the reply, stronger now. "Possible broken ribs, injured leg, but I'm conscious and stable on the ledge." Morrison exchanged glances with Thompson, who was already preparing his medical kit. A broken arm and possible internal injuries were serious, but they were far from the worst-case scenario they had been preparing for. "Dr. Martinez, we're going to rappel down to your position. It's going to take us some time to set up safely, but we want you to know that help is on the way." "Thank you," the voice called back, and Morrison could hear the emotion in those two words. "I've been here since yesterday. I was beginning to think." "You're going to be fine," Morrison replied firmly. "Just stay calm and stay still. We'll be there soon." Rodriguez had completed his initial anchor setup and was beginning to test the system. Morrison watched his teammate work with the confidence that came from years of shared experiences in dangerous situations. Rodriguez had successfully conducted technical descents in Afghanistan's mountains, Iraq's urban canyons, and training areas around the world. If anyone could safely reach the trapped hiker, it was him. "Stone," Rodriguez called softly, "we've got a problem." Morrison moved to where his teammate was studying the cliff face below. Rodriguez pointed to a section of the rock wall about halfway down to the target ledge. "See that overhang? It's more severe than it looked from the helicopter. Standard rappelling techniques won't work. We'll swing away from the cliff face and won't be able to reach the ledge." Morrison studied the problem. The overhang Rodriguez had identified was a section where the cliff face actually curved outward, creating a roof-like structure that would prevent a straight vertical descent to the ledge below. "Options?" Morrison asked. "We need to use advanced technical climbing techniques. Essentially, we'll have to rappel partway down, then traverse across the cliff face to get around the overhang, then continue the descent to the ledge." Morrison understood immediately why this was a problem. The technique Rodriguez was describing required specialized equipment and advanced climbing skills that went far beyond standard military training. It was the kind of operation that civilian rescue teams trained for specifically, using techniques developed by rock climbers and mountain rescue specialists. But civilian rescue teams were still hours away, and the weather was continuing to deteriorate. Morrison looked up at the gathering clouds and made his decision. "Do we have the gear?" "We've got enough rope and hardware," Rodriguez replied. "But it's going to be technical, very technical." "Can you do it?" Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, studying the cliff face with the intensity of someone calculating angles, distances, and forces. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, I can do it, but I'll need Thompson to back me up on the medical side once I reach her." Morrison looked at his medic, who was already checking his own climbing gear. Thompson had served in mountain warfare units before joining the SEALs, and his medical training included emergency treatment in extreme environments. "I'll follow Rodriguez down," Thompson confirmed. "Between the two of us, we should be able to stabilize her for evacuation." The plan was ambitious and dangerous, requiring the kind of improvised technical climbing that was far outside normal SEAL operational parameters. But Morrison's team had not earned their reputation by playing it safe when lives were on the line. "Do it," Morrison ordered. "But I want constant communication, and if conditions become too dangerous, we abort and wait for specialized equipment." Rodriguez nodded and began the complex process of rigging the rope systems needed for the technical descent. Morrison watched his teammate work, marveling again at the skill level of the operators he was privileged to lead. Below them, Dr. Martinez waited on her narrow ledge, unaware that her rescue would require some of the most advanced climbing techniques in the military's arsenal. The race against time and weather was just beginning. Rodriguez checked his equipment one final time, running through the mental checklist that had become second nature after years of high-stakes operations. His climbing harness was secure, his helmet properly adjusted, and his rope system rigged according to specifications he had learned from some of the best technical climbers in the world. The wind was picking up, creating an additional challenge for the already complex rescue operation. Morrison watched from the cliff edge as his teammate prepared for what would be one of the most technically demanding climbs any of them had ever attempted. "Weather window is closing," Williams reported from his position monitoring communications. "Coast Guard is reporting deteriorating conditions moving in from the west." Morrison nodded grimly. They had perhaps 2 hours of viable climbing weather before the rescue would become impossible. After that, they would have to wait for the storm to pass, which could take days given the unpredictable nature of Pacific Coast weather systems. Rodriguez status report. "Anchor systems are solid," Rodriguez replied, his voice calm despite the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. "I've rigged a Z-pulley system for hauling Dr. Martinez up once we get her stabilized. First descent is ready to begin." Morrison looked down at the tiny figure on the ledge far below. From this distance, it was impossible to assess her true condition, but the fact that she was still conscious and able to communicate was encouraging. "Dr. Martinez," Morrison called down, "we're beginning the descent now. Our climber is going to come down to your position, but it's going to take some time because of the terrain. Just stay calm and conserve your energy." "I understand," came the reply, though her voice sounded weaker than it had earlier. Morrison wondered if shock was beginning to set in or if the extended exposure was taking its toll. Rodriguez clipped into his rappel device and moved to the edge of the cliff. For a moment, he stood silhouetted against the sky, checking his gear one last time. Then, with the fluid motion of someone who had made hundreds of similar descents, he leaned back and began his controlled fall down the cliff face. Morrison watched through binoculars as his teammates smoothly descended the first section of cliff. Rodriguez moved with economy and precision, using his feet to control his distance from the rock wall, while his hands managed the rope feeding through his rappel device. The first 100 feet went according to plan. Rodriguez reached the point where the overhang began, the section that would require the most advanced technical skills. Morrison could see him studying the rock formation, planning his approach to the horizontal traverse that would carry him around the obstacle. "First waypoint reached," Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, "beginning traverse sequence." What happened next was a masterclass in advanced climbing technique. Rodriguez anchored a new rope to the cliff face using specialized hardware called protection, creating a horizontal line that would allow him to swing across the face of the overhang. It was called a pendulum traverse, a technique normally used by expert rock climbers in some of the world's most challenging locations. Morrison watched as Rodriguez swung across the cliff face in a controlled arc, his body tracing a path through empty air before coming to rest against the rock wall on the far side of the overhang. It was the kind of move that required perfect timing and absolute confidence in equipment and technique. "Traverse complete," Rodriguez reported, continuing descent to target. Thompson was already preparing for his own descent, checking the medical supplies that would be essential for treating Dr. Martinez's injuries. The team had conducted emergency medical evacuations in combat zones, but never in terrain this challenging. Rodriguez continued his descent, now following a more direct line toward the ledge where Dr. Martinez waited. Morrison could see both figures now through his binoculars, Rodriguez moving steadily downward, and the motionless form of the woman they were trying to save. 50 feet from target," Rodriguez reported. "I can see her clearly now. She's conscious and alert, but her positioning suggests significant injuries." Morrison felt a familiar tension in his chest, the weight of responsibility for his team's safety combined with the urgent need to help a civilian in distress. Every mission carried risks, but rescue operations added an emotional component that military objectives often lacked. "Dr. Martinez," Rodriguez called out as he approached the ledge. "My name is Rodriguez. I'm with the Navy Rescue Team. How are you doing?" Sarah Martinez looked up at the figure descending toward her with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had spent over 24 hours on the narrow ledge, fighting pain, cold, and the growing conviction that she might die in this remote canyon. "I can't believe you're real," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I was starting to think I was hallucinating." Rodriguez touched down on the ledge with practiced precision, immediately assessing both the stability of their shared platform and the condition of the woman he had come to rescue. The ledge was even narrower than it had appeared from above, barely wide enough for two people to sit side by side. "You're real and you're going to be okay," Rodriguez assured her, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of dealing with crisis situations. "But I need to check your injuries before we can move you." Sarah nodded, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her broken ribs. Rodriguez began a systematic assessment, his hands moving with the sure touch of someone trained in field medicine. "Left arm is definitely broken," he reported through his radio. "Possible fracture of the radius and ulna. Left leg shows signs of significant soft tissue damage, but I don't think it's broken. Patient is showing signs of mild hypothermia and dehydration, but mental status is good." Morrison acknowledged the report while keeping one eye on the approaching weather. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, and the wind was beginning to pick up noticeably. "Thompson, begin your descent," Morrison ordered. "We need to get her stabilized and evacuated before this weather hits." Thompson began his own rappel, following the route that Rodriguez had pioneered. His descent was faster, benefiting from the anchor points and rope systems that Rodriguez had already established. On the ledge, Rodriguez was doing his best to make Sarah more comfortable while preparing for Thompson's arrival. He had wrapped her in an emergency blanket and was checking her hydration levels. "How did this happen?" Rodriguez asked, partly to keep Sarah talking and assess her mental state, and partly because he was genuinely curious about how a marine biologist had ended up in such a precarious position. Sarah's face darkened as she recounted the confrontation in the parking area, the aggressive behavior of Brad and his companions, and the push that had sent her tumbling down the cliff face. Rodriguez listened with growing anger, though he kept his expression neutral. As someone who had dedicated his life to protecting people, the idea that civilians had deliberately caused this situation filled him with disgust. "They just left you here?" he asked, unable to keep all emotion out of his voice. "I called for help for hours," Sarah replied, "but no one came, no one even answered." Rodriguez made a mental note to pass this information along to local law enforcement once the rescue was complete. If Sarah's account was accurate, those men were guilty of assault and reckless endangerment at minimum. Thompson arrived on the ledge with his medical kit, immediately beginning a more thorough assessment of Sarah's injuries. His training allowed him to perform diagnostic procedures that went far beyond Rodriguez's first aid skills. "Broken arm will need surgical repair, but it's not life-threatening," Thompson reported. "The ribs are fractured but don't appear to have punctured any organs. Blood pressure is low but stable. She's dehydrated and hypothermic, but both are manageable." Morrison felt relief wash over him. Sarah's injuries were serious but not critical, which meant they could take the time needed to evacuate her safely. "Can she handle the vertical evacuation?" Morrison asked through the radio. Thompson looked at Sarah, assessing not just her physical condition, but her psychological readiness for what would be an extremely challenging experience. "Dr. Martinez," Thompson said, "we're going to get you out of here using a rope system. You'll be secured in a special harness and pulled up the cliff face. It's going to be uncomfortable and probably scary, but it's completely safe. Do you think you can handle that?" Sarah looked up the cliff face toward the tiny figures visible on the rim far above. The prospect of being hauled up that vertical wall was terrifying, but no more terrifying than the alternative of spending another night on the ledge. "I can handle it," she said, though her voice betrayed her fear. "Just get me out of here." Thompson began the process of fitting Sarah into a rescue harness, a specialized piece of equipment designed to distribute the forces of a vertical haul across her entire body while protecting her injured limbs. The process was complicated by her broken arm, which had to be immobilized in a sling before the harness could be properly adjusted. Every movement caused Sarah obvious pain, but she gritted her teeth and cooperated with Thompson's instructions. Above them, Morrison was coordinating the haul system that would lift Sarah to safety. The other team members had rigged a complex arrangement of pulleys and anchors that would allow them to raise her smoothly, while Rodriguez and Thompson controlled her movement up the cliff face. "Storm's getting closer," Williams reported, monitoring weather updates from the Coast Guard. "We've got maybe an hour before conditions become dangerous." Morrison looked at the approaching wall of dark clouds and made his decision. They would evacuate Sarah first, then Rodriguez and Thompson. It would be tight, but they could make it work. "Beginning evacuation," Morrison announced. "All stations prepare for vertical haul." On the ledge, Thompson completed his final checks of Sarah's harness and medical condition. Rodriguez had rigged his own system to ascend alongside her, ready to assist if any problems developed during the climb. "Dr. Martinez," Thompson said, "you're going to feel yourself being lifted off the ledge in just a few seconds. Keep your eyes closed if it helps with the fear, and remember that you're completely secure." Sarah nodded, closing her eyes and trying to center herself the way she did when faced with challenging research problems. She felt the harness tighten around her body as the rope system engaged. Then, with a sensation that was both terrifying and miraculous, she felt herself lifted off the narrow ledge that had been her prison for over 24 hours. The journey up the cliff face began slowly, with Morrison's team carefully coordinating their efforts to ensure a smooth ascent. Sarah spun slowly on the end of the rope, catching glimpses of the vast drop below and the rocky walls sliding past on either side. Rodriguez ascended alongside her, his calm presence and steady voice providing reassurance during what was undoubtedly the most terrifying experience of her life. "You're doing great, Dr. Martinez," he said, his voice cutting through the wind and her fear. "Just a little bit farther." Above them, Morrison watched the approaching storm clouds and calculated distances. They were going to make it, but just barely. The first fat raindrops were beginning to fall as Sarah's head appeared over the rim of the canyon. Strong hands reached down to pull her to safety, and Sarah Martinez found herself surrounded by Navy SEALs on solid ground for the first time in 24 hours. She was hurt, exhausted, and still in shock, but she was alive. The storm broke over the canyon just as Rodriguez and Thompson reached the rim, turning the cliff face into a treacherous waterfall that would have made rescue impossible. As the medic helicopter arrived to transport Sarah to the hospital, Morrison looked back at the canyon where they had found her. In a few more hours, the weather would have made rescue impossible. In a few more days, exposure would have killed her. But sometimes, Morrison reflected, timing and training came together to save a life, and sometimes that was enough. Detective Maria Santos had been working missing persons cases for 8 years, but she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. The rescue of Dr. Sarah Martinez from Devil's Canyon had been dramatic enough to make regional news, but the circumstances surrounding her fall were raising questions that went far beyond a simple hiking accident. Santos sat in her cramped office at the county sheriff's department, reviewing the preliminary reports from the rescue operation and the initial interview with Dr. Martinez. What she was reading didn't match the profile of a typical hiking mishap. According to the Navy SEAL team that had conducted the rescue, Dr. Martinez had provided a detailed account of events leading up to her fall. Her story described a confrontation with a group of men in the parking area that had escalated to physical aggression and resulted in her being pushed over the cliff edge. If Dr. Martinez's account was accurate, this wasn't an accident at all. It was assault, possibly attempted murder, and the perpetrators had left her to die in one of the most remote areas of the coastal mountains. Santos picked up her phone and dialed the hospital where Dr. Martinez was recovering from her injuries. The doctor who answered assured her that the patient was stable and alert enough to provide a formal statement. "Detective Santos," Dr. Martinez said when Santos arrived at her hospital room, "thank you for coming. I wasn't sure anyone would believe my story." Santos studied the woman lying in the hospital bed, noting the professional cast on her left arm, the bandages covering various cuts and scrapes, and the obvious pain medication that slightly slurred her speech. Despite her injuries, Dr. Martinez's eyes were clear and focused. "Dr. Martinez, I want you to tell me exactly what happened, starting from when you arrived at the trailhead parking area. Take your time and include every detail you can remember." For the next hour, Sarah recounted the events of Saturday morning in careful detail. Santos took notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details about the men who had confronted her. "You said the leader introduced himself as Brad," Santos noted. "Can you describe him?" "Early 30s, expensively dressed, very confident in the way that suggests he's used to getting his way. His gear looked brand new, like he'd bought everything at once from an expensive outdoor store." "What about the others?" "Three companions, all similar age and social class. One of them had an expensive watch that looked ridiculous on a climbing harness. Another one mentioned that Brad's father owned development projects along the coast." Santos underlined this detail. If Brad's family was involved in local real estate development, that might provide a pathway to identifying him through public records and business licenses. "Dr. Martinez, this is important," Santos said. "When they pushed you, do you believe it was intentional, or could it have been an accident during the confrontation?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly replaying the events in her mind. "The push itself might have been impulsive, but the way they surrounded me, the way they forced me toward the cliff edge, that was deliberate. And when I called for help after I fell, they never responded. They just left me there." Santos made additional notes about the apparent premeditation and the failure to render aid. Under state law, both factors could elevate the charges significantly if they could identify and locate the suspects. "Is there anything else you can remember about their conversation? Names, references to specific places or businesses?" "One of them mentioned something about knowing a way up the devil's backbone that bypassed permits and park regulations. They seemed to think that rules didn't apply to them because of Brad's family connections." Santos thanked Dr. Martinez for her cooperation and assured her that the investigation would be thorough. As she left the hospital, Santos was already formulating a plan to identify the suspects. Her first stop was the trailhead parking area where the incident had occurred. The site was managed by the State Park Service, which maintained a basic level of security, including vehicle registration logs for overnight parking. Park Ranger Tom Wilson had been the one to find Dr. Martinez's abandoned car and initiate the missing person report. He was a 30-year veteran of the Park Service with an encyclopedic knowledge of the local hiking community. "Detective Santos," Wilson said as they walked through the parking area, "I've been thinking about Dr. Martinez's story. If there were really four men with expensive gear planning to climb the devil's backbone, somebody would have noticed them." "What do you mean?" Wilson pointed toward the trail markers at the edge of the parking area. "The devil's backbone is restricted access, requires special permits and advanced certification. We only issue about a dozen permits per year, and I know every person who has current authorization." So either they were lying about their plans, or they were planning to climb illegally. "Exactly, and if they were planning an illegal climb, they would have had to park somewhere else. The Devil's Backbone access trail doesn't start from this parking area." Santos felt a surge of excitement. If the suspects had parked elsewhere, there might be additional witnesses or security footage from different locations. Where would they have parked for illegal access? Wilson consulted a topographical map, pointing to several locations along the coastal highway. "There are 3 or 4 places where experienced climbers park for unofficial access to advanced routes. None of them are legal, but we don't have the resources to patrol every access point." Santos spent the next day visiting each of the unofficial parking areas Wilson had identified. At the third location, she struck gold. The Lighthouse Point turnout was a scenic overlook about 2 miles north of the official trailhead. It was popular with tourists taking photographs, but Wilson had mentioned that it also provided access to several advanced climbing routes. The turnout was managed by the State Highway Department, which had installed security cameras to monitor illegal dumping and vandalism. Santos obtained the footage from the relevant time period and spent hours reviewing the recordings. At 9:47 a.m. on Saturday morning, a late-model BMW SUV had pulled into the turnout. 4 men in climbing gear had emerged from the vehicle, and Santos felt her heart rate increase as she recognized them from Dr. Martinez's description. The license plate was clearly visible in the footage. Santos ran it through the DMV database and found that the vehicle was registered to Bradford Morrison III, with an address in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the county. A quick background check revealed that Bradford Morrison III was the son of Bradford Morrison Jr., a prominent real estate developer who owned Morrison Development Company. The company specialized in luxury coastal properties and had been involved in several controversial development projects over the past decade. Santos now had a name, an address, and video evidence placing the suspects in the area at the time of the incident. But she needed more evidence to build a solid case that would hold up in court. Her next step was to visit the Morrison family compound, a sprawling estate overlooking the ocean. The property was surrounded by high walls and electronic security systems, suggesting that the family was well aware of their need for privacy. Santos identified herself to the security guard at the main gate and requested to speak with Bradford Morrison III regarding an incident at Devil's Canyon. After a brief phone call, she was directed to wait while the guard confirmed her credentials. 20 minutes later, a well-dressed man in his 50s approached the gate. Santos recognized him from newspaper photos as Bradford Morrison Jr., the family patriarch and head of Morrison Development Company. "Detective Santos," Morrison SR said, "I understand you want to speak with my son about some kind of hiking incident." "Yes, sir. I'm investigating an assault that occurred at Devil's Canyon this past Saturday. Your son and 3 companions were in the area at the time, and I need to ask them some questions." Morrison SR's expression didn't change, but Santos detected a subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was already aware of the situation. "I'm afraid my son isn't available for questioning at the moment," Morrison SR said carefully. "Perhaps you could speak with our family attorney instead." The request for an attorney was not technically an admission of guilt, but it suggested that the family was taking the situation seriously. Santos handed Morrison SR her business card and requested that his son contact her to schedule an interview. "Mr. Morrison," Santos said as she prepared to leave, "I should mention that we have video evidence placing your son's vehicle in the area at the time of the incident. This is a serious matter involving potential felony charges." Morrison SR accepted the card without comment, but Santos could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing the family's options, probably considering how much influence and money it would take to make the problem disappear. Santos returned to her office and began building the case file. The video evidence was strong, but she needed additional corroboration to prove that Bradford Morrison III and his companions had actually encountered Dr. Martinez. She contacted the Navy SEAL team that had conducted the rescue, hoping they might have additional information from their interaction with Dr. Martinez. Commander Morrison was professional and cooperative, providing a detailed account of the rescue operation and Dr. Martinez's condition when they found her. "Commander," Santos said, "in your professional opinion, were Dr. Martinez's injuries consistent with an accidental fall?" "Detective, I've seen a lot of combat injuries and accident victims. Dr. Martinez's injuries suggested a fall from significant height, but her positioning and the mechanism of injury were consistent with someone being pushed or shoved rather than simply losing her footing." The commander's assessment supported Dr. Martinez's account of events, but Santos knew that medical speculation wouldn't be enough to secure a conviction. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the security footage from Lighthouse Point for the 3rd time, Santos noticed something she had initially overlooked. After Bradford Morrison III and his companions had departed in their BMW, another vehicle had arrived at the turnout. An older Toyota pickup truck had parked in the same space, and Santos could see a single occupant emerge with what appeared to be professional camera equipment. Santos ran the license plate for the Toyota and found that it belonged to Marcus Chen, a freelance nature photographer who specialized in coastal landscapes. A quick internet search revealed that Chen maintained an active social media presence featuring his photography work. Santos contacted Chen and explained that she was investigating an incident that occurred near Lighthouse Point on Saturday morning. Chen was immediately cooperative and eager to help. "I was there photographing the storm front that was moving in," Chen explained. "I remember seeing some kind of commotion at the Devil's Canyon trailhead area, but I was too far away to see what was happening." "Did you photograph anything that morning that might have captured the trailhead area?" Chen pulled out his laptop and began scrolling through hundreds of images from Saturday's shooting session. After several minutes, he stopped at a photograph that made Santos's pulse quicken. The image showed the approaching storm clouds, but in the lower right corner, Santos could clearly see the parking area where Dr. Martinez had been confronted. The photograph had been taken with a high-resolution telephoto lens, and she could make out several figures near the cliff edge. "Mr. Chen," Santos said, "I'm going to need copies of these photographs for evidence. This could be crucial to our case." Chen agreed to provide the photographs and even enhanced them using professional photo editing software. The enhanced images showed Bradford Morrison III and his companions surrounding Dr. Martinez near the cliff edge, providing visual corroboration of her account. With video evidence, photographic documentation, and witness testimony, Santos finally had the foundation for a solid criminal case. She prepared arrest warrants for Bradford Morrison III and his 3 companions on charges of assault, reckless endangerment, and failure to render aid. The arrests would have to be coordinated carefully, given the Morrison family's wealth and political connections. Santos knew that the case would likely involve high-powered defense attorneys and significant media attention. But as she reviewed Dr. Martinez's medical reports and the photographs of her rescue from the narrow ledge, Santos was confident that justice would be served. The evidence was clear, and no amount of money or influence could change the facts of what had happened in Devil's Canyon. The investigation was far from over, but the pieces were falling into place. Soon, the men who had left Dr. Martinez to die would have to face the consequences of their actions. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, local residents, and supporters of Dr. Sarah Martinez as the trial of Bradford Morrison III and his 3 companions entered its final day. Over the past 2 weeks, the case had become a symbol of justice versus privilege, drawing attention from across the state. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh had built her case methodically, presenting evidence that painted a clear picture of the events leading to Dr. Martinez's near-death experience on the narrow ledge in Devil's Canyon. The prosecution's case relied on multiple forms of evidence: security footage, enhanced photographs, witness testimony, and expert analysis of the crime scene. Bradford Morrison III sat at the defendant's table alongside his 3 co-defendants, Michael Patterson, James Wright, and David Coleman. All 4 men were represented by a team of high-powered defense attorneys led by Charles Blackwood, one of the most expensive criminal lawyers in the state. The defense strategy had been predictable from the beginning: claim that the incident was a tragic accident, argue that Dr. Martinez had provoked the confrontation through her insulting behavior, and suggest that her fall was the result of her own carelessness rather than deliberate action by the defendants. Judge Patricia Williams had managed the trial with firm professionalism, refusing to be influenced by the media attention or the obvious wealth disparity between the defendants and the victim. She had allowed the prosecution to present their evidence without interference, while ensuring that the defendants received fair representation. Dr. Sarah Martinez had testified for 2 full days, recounting her ordeal with quiet dignity and remarkable precision. Her account of the confrontation in the parking area had been supported by multiple pieces of evidence, and her description of the 24 hours spent trapped on the ledge had moved several jurors to tears. "Dr. Martinez," D.A. Walsh had asked during her testimony, "when the defendants surrounded you near the cliff edge, what was going through your mind?" "I realized that I was in real danger," Sarah had replied. "These weren't just angry hikers having an argument. They were deliberately intimidating me, and when I tried to back away, they followed me toward the cliff edge." The defense had attempted to portray Sarah as an arrogant academic who had insulted the defendants and provoked their reaction. Attorney Blackwood had spent hours questioning her about her climbing experience, her decision to hike alone, and her allegedly condescending attitude toward other hikers. "Dr. Martinez," Blackwood had asked, "isn't it true that you called my client stupid during this alleged confrontation?" "Yes," Sarah had admitted. "I said that ignoring safety rules was stupid. I was referring to his decision to attempt an advanced climb without proper permits or preparation." "So you were, in fact, insulting these men and questioning their intelligence." "I was pointing out that their planned activity was dangerous and illegal. If that came across as insulting, then yes, I suppose I was being insulting. The defense had tried to use this admission to support their claim that Sarah had provoked the incident, but DA Walsh had effectively countered during her redirect examination. Dr. Martinez, Walsh had asked, in your opinion, does verbal disagreement about safety procedures justify physical assault? Absolutely not, Sarah had replied firmly. Even if I was rude or insulting, that doesn't give anyone the right to push me off a cliff. The prosecution's expert witnesses had provided compelling technical evidence. Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader who had led Sarah's rescue, had testified about the nature of her injuries and their consistency with being pushed rather than simply falling. Commander Morrison, DA Walsh had asked, based on your extensive experience with trauma injuries, what did Dr. Martinez's injuries tell you about the mechanism of her fall? The pattern of injuries was consistent with someone who had been shoved or pushed with considerable force, Morrison had testified. An accidental slip would have produced a different injury pattern. The photography expert who had enhanced Marcus Chen's images had demonstrated how the pictures clearly showed the defendant surrounding Sarah near the cliff edge. The enhanced images were compelling evidence that supported her account of being cornered and threatened. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was the security footage from Lighthouse Point, which showed the defendants arriving in the area at the exact time Sarah had described, and more importantly, showed them leaving without reporting any incident to authorities. Members of the jury, DA Walsh had said during her closing argument, the evidence in this case tells a clear story. 4 wealthy young men decided that they were above the law, above common courtesy, and above basic human decency. When Dr. Martinez dared to question their judgment, they responded with violence that could have killed her. Walsh had walked the jury through each piece of evidence, building a compelling narrative that left little room for reasonable doubt. These men didn't accidentally bump into Dr. Martinez, Walsh continued. They deliberately cornered her, deliberately forced her toward the cliff edge, and deliberately pushed her into a canyon where they expected her to die. Then they left her there, making no attempt to help or even to report the incident to authorities. The defense's closing argument had focused on reasonable doubt and the possibility that the incident had been a tragic accident. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Attorney Blackwood had argued, my clients are guilty of nothing more than poor judgment and unfortunate timing. Yes, they had a heated argument with Dr. Martinez. Yes, she fell during that argument, but there is no credible evidence that they intended to harm her. Blackwood had attempted to cast doubt on the photographic evidence and expert testimony, suggesting that the prosecution was asking the jury to speculate about the defendant's intentions based on circumstantial evidence. But the jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. On the charge of assault in the second degree, the jury foreman announced, we find the defendant Bradford Morrison III guilty. The guilty verdicts continued for all 4 defendants on multiple charges. The jury had convicted them of assault, reckless endangerment, and failure to render aid. They had acquitted them on the most serious charges of attempted murder, but the convictions were still significant felonies carrying potential prison sentences. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and impact statements from the victim. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Martinez addressed the media with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the trial. I want to thank the jury for their careful consideration of the evidence, she said. This case was never about revenge or money. It was about accountability. People need to understand that wealth and privilege don't excuse criminal behavior. She also made a point of thanking the Navy SEAL team that had saved her life. Commander Morrison and his team risked their own lives to rescue me from an impossible situation, she said. Without their courage and skill, I wouldn't be here today. Commander Morrison, who had attended the trial as a prosecution witness, was characteristically modest about his team's role. We were just doing our job, he told reporters. Dr. Martinez is the real hero here. She survived 24 hours in conditions that would have killed most people, and she had the courage to fight for justice even when powerful people were trying to silence her. The conviction sent shockwaves through the local community, particularly among the wealthy elite who had assumed that Bradford Morrison III's family connections would protect him from serious consequences. Bradford Morrison, Jr., the defendant's father, issued a statement through his attorney expressing disappointment with the verdict while insisting that his son was a good person who had made a terrible mistake. "This is a tragedy for all involved," the statement read. "My son never intended to harm Dr. Martinez, and our family deeply regrets that this incident occurred." But many community members saw the conviction as a long overdue example of justice being applied equally regardless of wealth and social status. Detective Maria Santos, who had built the case against the defendants, expressed satisfaction with the outcome. "This investigation proved that good police work and solid evidence can overcome any amount of money or influence," she said. "Dr. Martinez deserved justice, and I'm glad we were able to deliver it." The sentencing hearing drew even more media attention than the trial itself. Judge Williams had received dozens of letters from community members, expert witnesses, and supporters of Dr. Martinez, all urging significant prison sentences for the defendants. Dr. Martinez herself provided a victim impact statement that was both powerful and restrained. "Your Honor," she said, addressing Judge Williams directly, "what these men did to me changed my life in ways I'm still discovering. The physical injuries have largely healed, but the psychological trauma remains. I have nightmares about falling, about being trapped, about calling for help that never comes." She paused, composing herself before continuing. "But I've also learned something important through this ordeal. I've learned that there are people like Commander Morrison and his team who will risk everything to help a stranger. I've learned that there are people like Detective Santos who will work tirelessly to see that justice is done. And I've learned that ordinary citizens serving on juries will hold powerful people accountable when presented with the truth." Judge Williams sentenced Bradford Morrison III to 4 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years. His 3 companions received sentences ranging from 2 to 3 years, reflecting their lesser roles in the incident. The sentences were significant enough to send a message about the seriousness of the crimes, while acknowledging that the defendants had no prior criminal records and had shown some remorse for their actions. In her sentencing statement, Judge Williams addressed the broader implications of the case. "This case highlights the dangerous intersection of privilege, arrogance, and violence," she said. "The defendants believed that their wealth and social status exempted them from the rules that govern civilized behavior. They were wrong, and they will now face the consequences of that error in judgment." The case had lasting effects beyond the individual defendants. The Morrison family's real estate business suffered significant damage to its reputation, leading to the cancellation of several high-profile development projects. Bradford Morrison, Jr., was forced to step down from his leadership roles in several civic organizations. More broadly, the case sparked conversations about privilege, accountability, and the justice system's ability to handle cases involving wealthy defendants. For Dr. Sarah Martinez, the conclusion of the trial marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She returned to her work as a marine biologist, but she also became an advocate for wilderness safety and victims' rights. She established a foundation that provided wilderness safety education and supported search and rescue operations in remote areas. The foundation was funded partly by the civil settlement she reached with the Morrison family, which was reported to be in the millions of dollars. Commander Morrison and his SEAL team were recognized with commendations for their heroic rescue operation. The technical climbing techniques they had used to reach Dr. Martinez were incorporated into training programs for military and civilian rescue teams. The case became a textbook example of how modern investigative techniques, including enhanced digital photography and security footage analysis, could be used to solve complex crimes and deliver justice for victims. But perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrated that no one is above the law, regardless of their wealth, social status, or family connections. Bradford Morrison III and his companions had learned that lesson the hard way, and their conviction served as a warning to others who might be tempted to believe that privilege exempts them from the consequences of their actions. Dr. Sarah Martinez had survived her ordeal on the narrow ledge in Devil's Canyon, but more than that, she had emerged stronger and more determined to fight for justice and accountability. The men who had thrown her over the edge expecting her to disappear had instead created a powerful advocate for victims' rights and wilderness safety. And the Navy SEALs who had scaled the canyon walls without equipment to save her life had proven once again that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not on distant battlefields, but in the quiet moments when ordinary people choose to risk everything to help a stranger in need.